Mr. DarXnights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's get comfortable and begin. Curse of Wealth ***. The wind howled through the cracked windows of the old mansion, carrying with it a chill that seemed to seep into every crevice of the crumbling estate. The Rosens had once been a name spoken with reverence, their wealth and influence stretching far beyond the small town they called home. But the mansion, now dark and hollow, whispered of a past long forgotten, a past haunted by greed, betrayal, and a curse that no one dared to speak of. Detective Alden Blake stepped cautiously through the grand entrance, his boots echoing on the marble floor. The air was thick with dust, the kind that only accumulates when time has been left to run its cruel course. The house was a ghost of what it once was. The opulence of the past had faded, leaving behind only remnants of a forgotten fortune. Blake had heard the rumors. He had heard about the cursed fortune that had been hidden away by the Rosen family decades ago, a fortune that had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers and shattered lives. It was said that the wealth was not just material, but something far darker, an ancient power that twisted those who sought it, driving them to madness and death. But Blake didn't believe in curses. He believed in facts, in evidence, in the truth that could be uncovered through hard work and determination. Still, as he made his way through the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like a warning. He had dealt with many strange cases in his career, but there was something different about this one, something that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The house felt alive in a way that unsettled him, like it was breathing, waiting for him to uncover its secrets. He reached the grand staircase, its banister worn smooth from years of use. At the top, he noticed a large portrait of the Rosen family, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. The faces were stern, their expressions unreadable, but Blake could feel the weight of their gaze pressing down on him. The matriarch of the family, Clara Rosen, stood proudly at the center, flanked by her husband and children. They had all disappeared, one by one, their fates unknown. Some said they had met tragic ends. Others claimed they had simply vanished, leaving no trace behind. Blake approached the portrait, studying it carefully. Something about Clara's eyes unsettled him. It was as if she knew something that no one else did. As he reached out to touch the frame, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candle he had been holding. The sudden darkness sent a shiver down his spine, but he quickly regained his composure. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and he could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the walls, like fingernails dragging across stone. "Get a grip, Blake," he muttered to himself. "There's no such thing as curses." But as he turned away from the portrait, he couldn't help but feel that the house was not as empty as it seemed. There were stories about this place, about the strange noises that echoed through the halls at night, about the flickering lights and the cold spots that appeared without warning. It was said that Clara had hidden the fortune in a place only she knew, and that after her death, no one had ever been able to find it. Some believed that the fortune was buried with her, hidden in the very walls of the mansion. Blake made his way deeper into the house, his flashlight illuminating the dark corners. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. It wasn't the kind of silence you find in an empty house, but the kind that fills a place with something more, a presence, a watchful eye. The house had seen things that were best left forgotten. He entered what appeared to be a study, the room dimly lit by the weak beam of his flashlight. Dust covered the shelves, and books lay scattered across the desk, as though they had been hastily abandoned. There was something about the room that felt wrong. The air was heavier here, thicker, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for him to discover the truth. Blake moved to the desk, his eyes scanning the papers scattered across its surface. Old letters, contracts, and family documents filled the drawers, but it was a small, leather-bound journal that caught his attention. He flipped it open, the pages yellowed with age, and began to read. The journal belonged to Clara Rosen. Her handwriting was elegant, but there was an unmistakable tremor to it, as if she had been writing in fear. The words on the page spoke of a secret, a hidden fortune that could change everything. Clara described the curse that had been placed upon her family, a curse that had been passed down through generations. She had tried to hide the fortune, to keep it away from those who would seek it, but even she knew that it was only a matter of time before someone would come looking for it. Blake felt a chill crawl up his spine as he read. Clara's words spoke of betrayal, of loved ones turning on each other in a desperate attempt to claim the wealth. And then the final entry, a cryptic message that sent a cold shiver through his entire body. Underscore, the fortune is hidden beneath the floorboards. But beware, Alden Blake. The curse is not finished with us. It will follow you, just as it followed them. Underscore. The words seemed to burn into his mind as he stood there in the dim light, the air around him growing colder. He looked down at the journal, his heart pounding in his chest. Could this be true? Was the fortune really hidden beneath the floorboards, just as Clara had written? And if so, what price would he have to pay to find it? Blake's grip tightened on the journal as a sudden noise echoed through the house. A low, distant groan, like the sound of something heavy shifting in the dark. His heart raced. The mansion had been silent for so long, and now, in the dead of night, it seemed to be alive again, stirring, waiting for him to make his move. He set the journal down and moved cautiously toward the corner of the room, his flashlight illuminating the floor. There, beneath the old rug, he saw it, a small wooden hatch just big enough to fit his hand through. Blake knelt down, his fingers trembling as he gripped the handle. As he pulled the hatch open, the air grew colder still, and the faintest whisper brushed against his ear. Underscore, leave now, or you will never leave. Underscore. Blake froze. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was clear. He felt a presence behind him, as if something was watching, waiting for him to make the wrong choice. But he had come this far. He had to know the truth. With a deep breath, Blake reached into the darkness beneath the floorboards. The storm had settled by the time Officer Garrett entered the mansion, his footsteps echoing through the silent, abandoned hallways. The eerie quiet seemed to stretch endlessly, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. His partner, K9 Officer Duke, trotted alongside him, the heavy dog's collar making faint clinking sounds as it bounced against his strong neck. Garrett's mind raced with unanswered questions. Why had the mansion's previous owners disappeared without a trace? No note, no message, just an entire family wiped from existence. All their wealth, their treasures, left behind like forgotten relics. People had spoken in hushed whispers about the vanished fortune, but no one had truly looked into it, not until Garrett and Duke had been called in. He glanced at his partner, Duke, who was sniffing the air, his body tense as though sensing something the human eye couldn't. Garrett's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't shake the feeling that the house, with its crumbling walls and empty windows, was watching them, its secrets buried deep within the very foundation. They weren't alone here. Something or someone was waiting for them. The floorboards creaked under their weight as they ventured deeper into the house. It was cold, almost unnaturally so, despite the warm storm raging outside. The walls, once grand and adorned with fine art, were now covered in layers of dust and grime. The once pristine chandeliers hung crookedly, the crystal beads shimmering with an unnatural gleam that reflected no light. The air felt thick with the past, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Garrett reached the staircase, his hand hovering near the polished banister. His instincts told him to be cautious, to tread carefully, but something stronger told him that time was running out. Something was about to happen. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. "Stay close, Duke," Garrett muttered, more to himself than to his partner. Duke's low growl in response was the only sound in the heavy silence. They moved up the staircase, the heavy thud of their boots reverberating in the emptiness. As they reached the top, the air grew colder, and the silence seemed more oppressive. Every step felt like they were intruding on something forbidden, something that had been locked away for far too long. The grand hallway stretched before them, lined with doors leading to rooms that had been untouched for years. Garrett's flashlight swept over the doors, each one more imposing than the last. His gaze lingered on one in particular, a massive oak door at the far end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. His heart skipped. Something told him that whatever lay behind that door was the key to understanding the mysteries of the vanished fortune. "Let's go, Duke," Garrett whispered. Without hesitation, Duke trotted ahead, his senses sharper than ever. As they approached the door, the temperature dropped even further. The hairs on the back of Garrett's neck stood on end, a chill running through his body. He pushed the door open slowly, the creak of the hinges the only sound breaking the silence. What they found inside made Garrett's stomach churn. The room was a study, its walls lined with shelves filled with old books and papers, but it was what lay on the desk that caught his attention. A large, ornate chest sat in the center, its lid open, but what really grabbed his attention were the piles of yellowed papers scattered around it, papers covered in old handwriting. Garrett stepped closer, his eyes scanning the papers. They looked like old ledgers, perhaps records of the mansion's fortune, each entry more cryptic than the last. But one page stood out, its edges torn, the ink smeared in places. It was a list of names, dates, and symbols that seemed to shift in the flickering light of his flashlight. Before he could inspect it further, Duke let out a sudden, sharp bark, his body rigid with tension. Garrett spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the empty room, the piles of papers, and the eerie silence. Then, something strange happened. The air seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped even lower. A faint whisper, almost inaudible, echoed through the room. Garrett's breath caught in his throat, and he felt his pulse quicken. The whisper wasn't from Duke. It was from somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the mansion. He didn't hesitate. With a quick motion, Garrett grabbed the page he had been inspecting and stuffed it into his jacket pocket. "We need to get out of here, Duke," he muttered under his breath. But as they turned to leave, a sudden crash from upstairs made them both freeze in place. It was loud, like something heavy had fallen, and the sound echoed through the entire house. Garrett's heart raced. Whatever was going on here, whatever had caused the family to disappear, it was starting to unravel, and they were right in the middle of it. "Stay close," Garrett whispered to Duke, who was already tense. His ears perked, ready for whatever came next. They moved toward the staircase, but as they did, the whispering grew louder. Now it was no longer faint, but clear, sharp, and unintelligible. It seemed to be coming from all directions, swirling around them like a vortex, pushing them forward. With a deep breath, Garrett and Duke descended the stairs, their footsteps quickening. The house seemed to close in on them, the shadows growing longer, the air heavier. They were no longer alone. The mansion had begun to reveal its secrets, and it wasn't about to let them leave without uncovering all of them. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the house was eerily still, as if it were waiting for the final piece to fall into place. Garrett had no idea what was in store for them next, but he knew one thing for certain. They were going to need more than just courage to survive the truth of the vanished fortune. Let me know what you think and if you'd like any adjustments. The staircase creaked under Garrett's boots as he descended into the depths of the mansion. The feeling of unease that had started to build in his chest was now a tight knot, a weight pressing down on him with every step. Duke, ever vigilant, trotted beside him, his ears twitching at every small sound. The whispering that had followed them from the upstairs study seemed to linger in the air, growing louder and more distorted with every passing second. Garrett's flashlight flickered briefly, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls of the darkened hallway. His breath came in shallow gasps, the cold air making the back of his throat burn. The storm outside had begun to die down, but inside the mansion, it felt as if a storm of its own was raging, one that had been building for years. They reached the bottom of the stairs, the door at the far end of the hallway standing ominously before them. It looked like any other door in the mansion, heavy oak, carved with intricate designs, but something about this one felt different. Garrett could sense it. This was where the answers lay. the key to understanding the vanished fortune. He wasn't sure how he knew this, but every fiber of his being told him to open that door. "Stay close, Duke," Garrett murmured, his hand resting on the cold, brass handle. He turned it slowly, the hinges groaning in protest as he pushed the door open. Inside, the room was unlike anything Garrett had seen so far. It was a grand library, its shelves lined with rows upon rows of dusty, ancient books. The air smelled faintly of mildew, but there was something else too, a strange, metallic scent, as though the very walls were holding something they didn't want to release. The room was lit only by the flickering light from Garrett's flashlight. The shadows seemed to stretch and dance across the walls, twisting into strange shapes. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a large wooden desk at the far end. On it, there were several open books, each one covered in yellowed pages. But there was one book that stood out, a thick leather-bound volume sitting at the center of the desk, its cover marked with strange symbols. Before Garrett could approach it, Duke suddenly stiffened, his body tense as he growled low in his throat. Garrett froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispering had stopped. The air had grown still. A cold, suffocating silence had descended on the room. "Duke," Garrett whispered, his voice barely audible. But Duke didn't respond. He was focused on something in the corner of the room, his eyes fixed on a shadow that seemed to move, twitching in and out of view. Garrett's grip tightened around his flashlight as he stepped forward, trying to make sense of what was happening. His mind raced, but before he could think further, the door behind him slammed shut with a force that made the entire room shudder. Garrett spun around, his heart nearly leaping out of his chest, but there was no one there. The door had simply closed on its own, as though some unseen force had pushed it shut. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in his chest, but he forced it down, taking slow, steady breaths. Whatever was happening here, whatever force was at work in this house, it wasn't going to scare him off. He was here for a reason, and he wasn't going to leave until he had answers. Turning back to Duke, Garrett moved cautiously toward the desk. The strange book in the center of it called to him, its cover shimmering in the dim light, as if it were alive. As he approached, the temperature in the room dropped even further. Garrett could see his breath now, misting in the cold air. He reached out and opened the book, his fingers brushing against the cracked leather. The pages inside were filled with more of the same cryptic symbols and strange writings he had seen earlier. But as he turned the pages, his eyes landed on something that sent a chill straight down his spine. It was a map, a detailed, hand-drawn map of the mansion, complete with symbols marking various rooms and hallways. And at the center of it, written in bold, uneven letters, were the words, "The Vanished Fortune." Garrett's mind raced. This was it. This was the key. But before he could study the map further, Duke let out a sharp bark, his body shaking with fear. Garrett snapped his head around, but there was nothing there. The room, though dark and foreboding, appeared empty. Still, the feeling of being watched, of being followed, pressed on him from all directions. A soft rustling noise came from behind him. Garrett turned, his pulse quickening. The sound was coming from the corner of the room, where Duke had been fixated moments ago. A faint, ghostly figure seemed to flicker in the shadows, a figure that looked almost human, but not quite. It was as if the shadow itself was alive, shifting and twisting like smoke. Garrett's heart slammed against his ribcage as the figure began to move toward him. The room seemed to distort, the walls bending as if the very fabric of reality was warping. Duke growled louder now, his teeth bared, but the figure didn't stop. It continued to approach, its form becoming clearer, more solid with each passing second. "Get back, Duke!" Garrett shouted, his voice breaking the silence. But the dog didn't listen. Duke lunged forward, barking furiously at the figure, his growls turning into a deep, guttural snarl. The figure stopped, its movements slowing. It hovered just a few feet away from Garrett, its dark eyes staring into his with an intensity that sent a wave of dread through him. And then, in a voice that was more felt than heard, it spoke. "Leave, while you still can." The words echoed through the room, their meaning clear and chilling. Garrett's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a ghost. This wasn't just some lingering spirit. This was something far more dangerous, and it had been waiting for him. Duke barked again, but Garrett didn't know how much longer he could keep his composure. He needed to get out. He needed to find a way to escape the mansion. But as he turned to the door, he realized something that made his blood run even colder. The door was gone. There was no exit, no way out, just the figure in the corner, the eerie whispers in the air, and the suffocating silence of the room. Garrett reached for his gun instinctively, but when he looked down, his hands were empty. The weapon had vanished. Just like the door, he was trapped. The figure stepped forward again, its form becoming more distinct with every second. It wasn't just an apparition, it was a physical presence, something that was very much alive, or at least had been once. Garrett could see now that its features were vaguely human, but its face was twisted and distorted, its eyes hollow and empty, as though the soul that once inhabited it had long since departed. "Why are you here?" Garrett demanded, his voice trembling despite himself. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to the figure or to himself. What had brought him to this cursed mansion? What was it that had led him into this nightmare? The figure didn't respond immediately. It simply stared at him, its form flickering in and out of existence like a shadow caught in the wind. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Garrett could feel the cold seep into his bones. Finally, the figure spoke again, its voice like the sound of rustling paper, faint and distant. "You've awakened it. The fortune is no longer yours to claim." Garrett's mind raced. The vanished fortune. Was it just a myth? Had the house truly been abandoned? Or had it been hiding something much darker? And what did the figure mean by "you've awakened it"? Before he could ask another question, the figure lunged forward, its ghostly hands reaching out to grab him. Garrett stumbled back, his heart pounding as the shadows closed in around him. In that moment, he knew there was no turning back. He had crossed a line, and whatever force had been lying dormant in the mansion for so long was now awake. And it was coming for him. Here's Chapter 4 of The Vanished Fortune. Garrett's heart hammered in his chest as the shadowy figure lunged at him, its cold hands outstretched, fingers twisting unnaturally as if they were reaching for his very soul. In a split second, everything seemed to slow. The air grew colder still, each breath he took feeling like ice scraping against his lungs. He backed away, his legs barely able to support him as fear gripped him like an iron vice. But no matter how much space he tried to put between himself and the figure, it kept coming, its ghostly form flickering and warping in the dim light. "Stay away!" Garrett shouted, his voice hoarse, his hands trembling as he reached for anything to defend himself. The flashlight slipped from his grasp, rolling across the floor with a hollow clatter that only seemed to echo in the oppressive silence. Duke, barking furiously, lunged toward the figure, but it didn't seem to affect it. The dog's growls were lost in the air, swallowed by the unearthly presence. Garrett stumbled backward into the nearest bookcase, knocking over a pile of old books that crashed to the floor. The sound of them hitting the ground only seemed to deepen the dread hanging over him. Every instinct told him to run, but the feeling of being trapped in this cursed place kept him rooted to the spot. The figure stopped just short of Garrett, its hollow, empty eyes locking onto his with an intensity that nearly broke his resolve. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some specter that had lingered in this house. It was something far darker, something alive in a way that he couldn't understand, something that had waited for him. "You should not have come," the figure whispered, its voice faint and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. The words felt like they cut through Garrett's skin, settling in his bones like cold steel. Garrett's mind raced. He had to find a way out. He couldn't stay here, trapped in this nightmare with this thing. It wasn't just some random ghost. No, it was something more powerful, something tied to the very heart of this mansion. And somehow it was connected to the vanished fortune, to the mystery that had brought him here. The figure took another step forward, but this time, Garrett's instincts kicked in. His hand shot out, grabbing the nearest object he could find, one of the ancient books that had fallen to the floor. He swung it toward the figure, but it passed straight through its form as though it were made of mist. The figure didn't flinch. It didn't react at all. Garrett's heart sank. Nothing he did seemed to have any effect. "You've awakened it," the figure repeated, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "The fortune you seek is lost, and now you are cursed." Cursed? The word echoed in Garrett's mind, reverberating in the stillness of the room. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of information. Cursed? Was this what had driven the previous owners of the mansion to madness? Had they sought the fortune and been consumed by it? Was the mansion itself alive with some malevolent force? The figure raised its hand, and suddenly, the room seemed to close in on Garrett. The walls twisted and warped, stretching like rubber, and the bookshelves seemed to crawl toward him. Shadows darted at the edges of his vision, flickering with movement, as if the very house itself were trying to swallow him whole. Duke barked again, snapping at the shadows, but it was as if the dog's efforts were futile. He was as trapped as Garrett was, both of them ensnared by whatever curse had taken root in this forsaken place. "Get away from us!" Garrett shouted, his voice desperate as he backed up toward the desk. His hand brushed against the leather-bound book, the one that had revealed the map of the mansion earlier. The strange symbols and cryptic writings seemed to swirl in the dim light, as if mocking him. He grabbed the book, hoping it might offer some kind of clue, something that could help him escape this nightmare. The figure's eyes followed his every move, its form shifting uneasily as it closed the gap between them. "You are too late. The fortune has already been claimed." "Claimed?" Garrett echoed, his throat dry, his mind struggling to keep up with the madness unfolding before him. "What do you mean? What fortune?" "The vanished fortune," the figure whispered, as if the words themselves were too heavy to say aloud. "It was hidden away long ago, hidden from those who sought to claim it. But now it has been awakened, and you are its next victim." Before Garrett could respond, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, rattling the windows and knocking over more books. The room was alive with energy, a dark force swirling around him. The walls groaned, the floor beneath him vibrating as though something ancient and powerful was awakening deep within the mansion. The map in the book seemed to shimmer, its symbols glowing faintly as Garrett's eyes locked onto a new detail. There, at the center of the map, was a strange symbol that wasn't there before, a symbol he hadn't noticed earlier. It was a twisted spiral, its lines jagged and sharp. It was at the very heart of the mansion, in a place marked the vault. The vault, that was where the vanished fortune was hidden. Garrett could feel it in his bones. The answers were there, and if he wanted to survive, he had to find it. He had to get to the vault. But as if reading his thoughts, the figure lunged at him again, its hands reaching for his throat, its cold fingers brushing against his skin. Garrett gasped, the icy touch sending a shock of terror through his entire body. He felt the weight of the curse pressing down on him, the darkness closing in. "You can't escape," the figure hissed, its voice now a guttural rasp. "The mansion will not let you leave." But Garrett wasn't listening. His mind was racing, his thoughts spinning like a cyclone. The vault. He had to get to the vault. He couldn't stay here. Not with the figure. Not with the darkness that was consuming the mansion. He shoved the figure back with all his strength, but it didn't budge. It passed right through him, like smoke, dissipating into nothing. It was a trick of the mind, he realized. The figure wasn't real, not in the way he had thought. It was a manifestation of the curse itself, a physical form conjured by the mansion's malevolent spirit. And that spirit, whatever it was tied to the vanished fortune. Garrett turned and bolted for the door, desperate to escape the room, but the shadows seemed to reach out for him, grabbing at his legs, pulling him back. The mansion itself was alive, trying to keep him trapped inside its crumbling walls. He didn't have time to think. He had to find the vault. If he could just reach the vault, he might be able to put an end to this, to break the curse that had taken hold of the house. With every ounce of strength left in him, Garrett pushed forward, shoving past the shadows, ignoring the eerie whispers that filled the air. He was no longer sure of what was real and what was illusion. But one thing was clear: he couldn't stay here any longer, and the vault was his only hope. Garrett's footsteps echoed in the dark corridors of the mansion, each one carrying a sense of urgency that made his heart race. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself were breathing, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Duke was at his side, the dog's growls low and steady, his senses sharpened to the danger that lingered in the shadows. The map Garrett had found in the dusty book had pointed him in the right direction, but now, as he ventured deeper into the mansion's heart, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something far older, far more malevolent than anything he had encountered so far. The corridors twisted and turned, each passage more labyrinthine than the last, and the air grew colder the farther he went. It was as if the house itself was growing colder, more inhospitable the closer he came to the vault. And the whispers that had been barely audible before, grew louder, filling his ears with an unsettling chorus of voices. The words were unintelligible, but their tone was unmistakable. A warning, a plea, or perhaps a threat. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind slammed into him, sending a shiver down his spine. The hallway before him blurred, as if the very fabric of reality was warping. A chill ran through Garrett's bones, and he could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him harder than ever. Duke's bark shattered the stillness, the dog's eyes flashing as he darted ahead, his paws clicking against the stone floor. Garrett followed, his footsteps quickening, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before him. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The very air felt thick, suffocating, as if it were trying to crush the life out of him. And then, at the end of the hall, Garrett saw it. A massive door, ornately carved with symbols he didn't recognize. It was unlike any door he had seen before, an ancient, imposing barrier that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The vault. His heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the place that would hold the answers he so desperately sought. But as he approached, something strange happened. The temperature dropped even further, and the whispers in the air grew frantic. Garrett could feel them tugging at his mind, pulling at his sanity. The door before him seemed to shimmer, and in that moment, he knew he wasn't just walking into a room. He was walking into the very heart of the mansion's curse. Without thinking, Garrett reached out for the door handle, his fingers grazing the cold surface. The instant he touched it, a surge of energy shot through him, and for a brief moment, he saw flashes of images, flashes of people long gone, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes wide with fear. He saw shadows moving in the corners of his vision, figures that were not quite human, their forms flickering in and out of existence. But just as quickly, the images vanished, and the door creaked open, revealing the darkened interior of the vault. The room was vast, the ceiling stretching high above him, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with ancient books, relics, and strange artifacts that seemed to hum with power. But it wasn't the room itself that caught Garrett's attention. It was what lay at the center of the vault. A large, ornate chest sat on a pedestal, its surface intricately carved with symbols Garrett didn't recognize. The chest radiated a dark, oppressive energy, as if it were alive, pulsing with some unseen force. He could feel the weight of it, both physically and mentally, as though the chest itself was calling to him, urging him to open it. For a moment, Garrett stood frozen, staring at the chest. He knew instinctively that it held the vanished fortune. But he also knew deep down that the chest was more than just a container. It was a trap, a final piece in the mansion's dark puzzle. "Duke," Garrett whispered, his voice shaking. "Stay close." The dog, sensing his unease, growled softly and stood by his side, his eyes fixed on the chest. Garrett took a tentative step forward, the floor creaking beneath him. Each step felt heavier, as if the weight of the mansion itself were bearing down on him. The closer he got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of something ancient and forgotten. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing inward as if the vault were alive, reacting to his presence. When Garrett reached the chest, he hesitated. He didn't want to open it. He knew that once he did, there would be no turning back. The fortune, the curse, it was all connected, and whatever was inside the chest wasn't something he could easily walk away from. But he had come this far. He couldn't turn back now. With a trembling hand, Garrett placed his fingers on the chest's cold surface and slowly lifted the lid. A sharp, ear-piercing screech filled the room as the chest creaked open, and for a moment, Garrett thought he had made a mistake. A dark, inky mist poured out of the chest, swirling around him, its tendrils wrapping around his legs, his arms, his neck. He gasped, trying to pull away, but the mist held him fast, its cold fingers sinking into his skin, its touch like ice. "Leave now," a voice hissed, rising from the mist. It was low, guttural, like 1,000 whispers crashing into his ears at once. Garrett struggled, trying to break free, but the mist continued to coil around him, its grip tightening with every passing second. Duke barked furiously, his teeth bared, but even the dog's snarls couldn't break the hold of the mist. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape. You are bound by the curse. The fortune is not yours to take." Garrett's heart raced as the mist closed in around him, choking off his breath. He tried to think, tried to remember the map, the strange symbols that had led him here, but his mind was clouded, consumed by the presence of the mist. The words echoed in his mind, louder and louder. "The fortune is lost. You cannot have it. You must pay the price." The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, and for a moment, Garrett thought he would suffocate in the darkness. But just as he felt the last breath leave his lungs, he remembered something. The symbols in the book, the ones on the map. There was a way to break the curse. He wasn't just here to claim the fortune. He was here to destroy it. With a sudden burst of energy, Garrett ripped himself free from the mist's grasp, falling backward onto the cold floor of the vault. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the mist swirled around him. But this time, he wasn't afraid. This time, he understood. The fortune wasn't just a treasure, it was a curse. And if he was going to survive, if he was going to escape this nightmare, he had to destroy it, once and for all. Duke, barking furiously, stood beside him, his eyes filled with determination. Garrett looked at the dog, a silent understanding passing between them. They had come this far together, and they weren't about to turn back now. Garrett's mind raced as he scrambled to his feet, the weight of the curse pressing down on him like 1,000 pounds. Duke, his loyal companion, growled lowly, his fur bristling as the mist continued to swirl menacingly around them. The vault had become a prison, its dark corners closing in with every passing second, the air heavy with a malignant presence that seemed to reach out from the shadows. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. Every breath felt like it was being stolen from him, each heartbeat thundering in his chest as the oppressive energy of the room intensified. The chest, now wide open before him, still pulsed with a faint, sickly light. The mist that poured from it seemed to come from some otherworldly abyss, a manifestation of the evil that had long haunted this place. But Garrett couldn't afford to panic. "Not now. Duke," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We need to destroy it. The curse, the fortune, it's all tied to this damn chest." The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, his growls turning to a soft whine as if he understood the gravity of the situation. The mist twisted around them, whispering in unintelligible voices, but Garrett shut it out, focusing on the task at hand. He had come too far to fail now. With his eyes locked on the chest, Garrett's hand instinctively reached for the map he had found earlier. The symbols on it had been etched into his memory, but there was one symbol he had yet to fully understand. It was a strange, intricate design, a knot of some kind with a broken line running through the center. The map had shown this symbol in several places, but Garrett hadn't realized its significance until now. The knot, the broken line, it was a key, a way to break the curse. His heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him. He needed to destroy the chest, but to do that, he had to destroy the key first, the knot. Garrett's gaze shifted to the shelves surrounding the vault, scanning the relics and artifacts for something that could help him. And there, nestled among the ancient tomes and statues, he saw it. A sword. It was old, its hilt worn and covered in dust, but its blade gleamed with a faint, ethereal glow. The sword seemed to hum with energy, as if it, too, was aware of the dark forces that surrounded them. Garrett didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, reaching for the weapon with both hands and lifting it from its place on the shelf. As he held the sword, he could feel its power coursing through him, filling him with a strange sense of clarity. It was as though the sword itself had a purpose, to destroy the cursed fortune and break the chain that bound him to this nightmare. Garrett turned back to the chest, the sword gripped tightly in his hands. The mist writhed and hissed, but he didn't flinch. His gaze was fixed on the symbol of the knot, and with a deep breath, he took a step forward. His fingers trembled, but his resolve was unwavering. "Time to end this," he muttered. With a swift motion, he raised the sword high above his head and brought it down toward the chest. The blade cut through the air with a sharp hiss, the sound of metal striking metal echoing in the vault. For a moment, nothing happened. The mist continued to swirl around him, its cold tendrils wrapping around his legs and arms, but Garrett refused to let it stop him. Again, he swung the sword, this time aiming for the knot. The blade met its target with a loud crack, and a blinding flash of light erupted from the chest. Garrett shielded his eyes, stumbling backward as the energy surged from the chest, filling the room with a deafening roar. The sword, glowing with an otherworldly fire, vibrated in his hands as the knot symbol on the chest began to unravel. The chest shook violently, and for a moment, Garrett thought the entire mansion might collapse around him. And then, with a final, thunderous crack, the chest exploded. The force of the blast sent Garrett crashing to the floor, the sword slipping from his hands as the room was plunged into chaos. The vault trembled, the walls cracking, and the ceiling above groaned under the pressure. But through the smoke and dust, something emerged. A figure. At first, Garrett thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light, but as the figure took form, he realized it was something far worse. A man. But not a man. His skin was ashen, his eyes hollow and black. His limbs were twisted, distorted, as though he had been trapped in this form for centuries. His mouth opened wide, and a voice, low and guttural, escaped from within. "Fool," the figure hissed. "You think you can destroy what's been bound for centuries? The fortune is eternal. It cannot be erased." Garrett tried to push himself up, but the force of the figure's presence seemed to push him back to the ground, the weight of its malevolent energy crushing him under its gaze. Duke snarled, but the dog's barks were nothing more than a distant echo, drowned out by the figure's overwhelming power. "You don't understand," the figure continued, its voice growing louder. "The curse is not just tied to the fortune. It is the fortune. It is the curse. It is everything." Garrett's breath came in ragged gasps as he forced himself to stand, his mind spinning. This wasn't just about treasure. It wasn't about money or riches. It was about something far darker, something that had been bound to the mansion for centuries, feeding off the greed and misery of those who had sought its power. "Leave," the figure spat. "Leave while you still can. You have no idea what you've unleashed." Garrett stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the vault for anything that could help him. The walls were crumbling, the floor beneath him shaking with every passing second. He had to act quickly, or the curse would claim him just as it had claimed everyone else who had come before him. Without thinking, Garrett grabbed the sword again, his hand closing around the hilt with renewed determination. The figure was advancing on him now, its twisted form moving with unnatural speed, its eyes locked onto him with a hunger that made his blood run cold. The sword, its blade still glowing faintly, was his only hope. Garrett raised the sword high, the weight of it feeling like a burden, yet somehow lighter than before. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Duke, for the mansion's cursed past, and for everyone who had ever fallen victim to the vanished fortune. With a roar, Garrett charged at the figure, the sword held firm in his hands. The figure's eyes widened in surprise, but it was too late. As the blade pierced the figure's chest, the mansion itself seemed to howl, the walls cracking and the floor splintering beneath him. For a moment, everything was still, and then, with a final, deafening crash, the figure vanished, leaving behind nothing but a swirl of smoke and dust. This concludes Chapter 6. Let me know if you need any adjustments. Garrett lay on the ground, the sword still clenched tightly in his hand. His heart raced, his chest heaving as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The figure, the curse, the fortune. It had all happened so fast, yet the weight of the battle was still sinking in. He could feel the aftermath reverberating in his bones. A strange, eerie silence settling over the vault. It was over, or so he thought. But even in that moment of relief, something gnawed at him. A persistent unease that refused to let go. The mansion, once filled with the oppressive energy of the curse, seemed now eerily calm, but the air felt wrong. It felt as though something else was still lurking, something far darker. Duke padded over to him, his steps cautious, and nudged his side with his snout. Garrett managed a weak smile and reached out to pat the dog's head. "We made it, boy. We really did." But Duke growled low in his throat, his eyes narrowing, still alert. The dog's senses were far keener than Garrett's, and he knew it wasn't the time for comfort. There was something in the air, something still not quite right. Garrett slowly sat up, trying to shake off the lingering dread that clung to him like a heavy cloak. He scanned the room, his gaze flicking over the shattered remnants of the chest, the cracks running along the walls of the vault. The dim light from the glowing sword cast long, distorted shadows across the room, giving it a haunting, dreamlike quality. It almost felt as though time itself had slowed, as if the mansion was holding its breath, waiting. Something was still watching. "Duke," Garrett muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here." But as he stood, his legs shaky, he felt the unmistakable pull of something else, a force that was tugging at his mind, urging him to look back. It wasn't the chest. It wasn't the curse. It was something far more subtle, something insidious, as though the mansion itself was drawing him in, refusing to let go. Against his better judgment, Garrett's gaze shifted to the far corner of the vault, where a strange, faint glow was emanating from a small crevice in the wall. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run, but his feet moved toward the glow anyway. The pull was irresistible, as if the mansion had found a new way to haunt him, to trap him in its endless labyrinth of despair. Duke's growl deepened, but he stayed by Garrett's side, a silent protector. The dog seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere, the dark energy that still lingered in the air. But Garrett couldn't help himself. He had come this far. He couldn't leave until he understood what was truly happening in this cursed place. The closer Garrett got to the glow, the more his surroundings seemed to distort. The walls bent and swirled, and the floor seemed to shift beneath his feet. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw shadows moving in the periphery, watching him with unseen eyes. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. This wasn't real, couldn't be, but the glow continued to beckon. With trembling hands, Garrett reached toward the crack in the wall. His fingers brushed against the cold stone, and as he pressed harder, the crack widened, revealing an opening just large enough to fit through. The glow intensified, spilling out from the gap like liquid fire, casting a ghostly light across the room. Garrett hesitated for a moment, but then, driven by some unknown force, he squeezed through the opening. On the other side was something he could never have anticipated. A chamber, a hidden room deep beneath the mansion, untouched by time. The air was thick with dust, the walls lined with shelves and old wooden crates. But at the center of the room was an altar, ancient and carved with intricate symbols. And on the altar a chest, a smaller, more ornate chest, but it was unmistakably similar to the one he had destroyed. This wasn't just any chest. This was the heart of the curse. Garrett felt his stomach tighten as he stepped closer, his eyes locked onto the chest. It was beautiful, but the beauty was tainted. The intricate carvings on its surface seemed to pulse with life, the symbols shifting and changing as if they were alive. It was as though the chest itself was breathing, exhaling a slow, steady rhythm that mirrored Garrett's own heartbeat. The glow was coming from the chest. This is what we missed, Garrett whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. The chest in the vault hadn't been the source of the curse. It had been a decoy, a distraction. The real heart of the vanished fortune lay hidden beneath the mansion, and Garrett had just stumbled upon it. As his hand hovered over the chest, Garrett felt the temperature drop sharply. A cold, biting chill filled the room, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper, more tangible, as if they were alive, moving toward him. The air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural presence. Then, from the shadows, a voice spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Garrett froze, his hand hovering above the chest. The voice wasn't human, it was something else. Something older, darker. "Who are you?" Garrett called out, trying to steady his voice despite the rising fear in his chest. "What do you want?" The shadows shifted, and from the darkness emerged a figure. A man, but not a man. His form was twisted, a grotesque reflection of humanity, his face obscured by a tangle of shadow and light. His eyes, though, were clear, glowing with a fierce, unnatural light that bore into Garrett's soul. "I am the Keeper," the figure said, his voice a low rasp, filled with malice. "The one who guards the vanished fortune. And now, you will pay the price for disturbing it." Garrett stepped back, the realization hitting him with the force of a sledgehammer. This was it. The curse wasn't just some legend. It was real, and it wasn't done with him yet. Before he could react, the shadows lunged forward, enveloping him in a cold, suffocating embrace. The world spun as his body was pulled toward the chest. Duke barked furiously, but it was no use. The dark energy was too strong. "No!" Garrett shouted, struggling to break free. But the more he fought, the tighter the shadows gripped him, pulling him closer to the altar. As his fingers brushed the surface of the chest, a wave of agony shot through him. It was as though the chest itself was feeding on his very life force, draining him of strength, of will. Garrett gasped for air, but it was as though his lungs had forgotten how to breathe. His vision blurred, his body felt heavy, as if all the life had been sucked out of him. And in that moment, he understood. This wasn't just a curse. It was an insidious, living thing, a parasite that fed on those who sought its power. It had claimed his soul, and there was no escape. The last thing Garrett saw before everything went black was the glowing eyes of the Keeper, watching him with unblinking malice. And then silence. The silence was deafening. Garrett's mind was clouded by an overwhelming darkness, a cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. His limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if he were trapped in a world where time no longer mattered. He tried to scream, to fight back, but his voice was swallowed by the void. There was no sound, no movement, just the eternal, suffocating quiet. And then, slowly, it began to change. A faint sound pierced through the darkness, a distant echo, like the faintest whisper of a wind rustling through dead leaves. It was soft at first, barely audible, but gradually it grew louder, clearer. A voice. No, not a voice, many voices. Whispers, murmurs, like a chorus of the lost souls, trapped in the depths of this cursed mansion. Garrett's eyes flickered open. The world around him was a haze. He was no longer in the chamber with the chest. He was in some other place, some other time, lost in the shifting currents of his own fractured reality. The air was thick, and a faint, ghostly light illuminated the surroundings. A fog clung to the ground, swirling in unnatural patterns. He tried to move, but his body was unresponsive. His mind screamed for him to rise, to fight, but the force holding him down was too powerful. He could hear the whispers, growing louder, louder with each passing moment. "Garrett, you should not have come. You should not have disturbed the fortune." The voice was soft, ethereal, yet it carried with it a weight, a warning that made Garrett's heart race. Who was speaking? And why did it feel so familiar? "Who are you?" he finally managed to force out, his voice ragged, barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The fog parted slightly, revealing a figure standing in front of him. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow, a silhouette shrouded in mist. But as the figure moved closer, Garrett's breath caught in his throat. It was Duke. The dog's once warm, familiar eyes were now clouded with something else, something darker, colder. The life in him seemed to have faded, replaced by an eerie, unnatural glow. His fur was matted, his body twisted in strange ways, as though it had been distorted by the curse itself. Duke's mouth opened, but it wasn't the comforting bark Garrett had known. Instead, the words that escaped were cold, empty, tinged with sorrow and warning. "Garrett, the fortune will consume you. It will not release you. It has claimed me, and now it will claim you too." "No," Garrett whispered, his heart sinking. "No, this isn't real. This can't be happening." But Duke's eyes glowed brighter, and the dog began to fade, dissipating into the mist, as if he were never there to begin with. The last thing Garrett heard was the faint sound of the dog's mournful whine before the figure was gone. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A silhouette larger than anything he had seen before. The outline of the figure loomed over him like a giant, its features hidden in the shadows. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. The energy in the air intensified, crackling with power and darkness. The cold seemed to increase tenfold, biting into his skin like the sharpest ice. "Who are you?" Garrett called out again, but this time, his voice felt weak, distant. The figure stepped forward, and Garrett's heart nearly stopped in his chest. It was the Keeper, the same twisted form he had seen in the vault. But now it was different. It was alive. Its face was a mask of shadow, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. It was the embodiment of the curse, the living, breathing force that had bound him here. "I am the Keeper of the vanished fortune," the figure rasped, its voice like nails scraping against stone. "I am the one who watches, the one who ensures that none escape the grasp of the curse. And you," the figure's eyes narrowed, its voice growing darker with each word. "You are mine now." Garrett felt his body grow colder as the words echoed in his mind. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing in on him, wrapping around him like chains, tightening with each passing second. The figure raised a hand, and Garrett's vision blurred as the world around him spun. "No," Garrett whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "Please, you should have known better," the Keeper said coldly. "The fortune is not to be disturbed. You have awakened it, and now it will never let you go." The fog thickened around Garrett, swirling faster and faster, until he could no longer see. His thoughts became clouded, his vision consumed by the fog and darkness. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices calling out to him from the void. He tried to push through it, tried to escape, but it was no use. The darkness consumed him. Time passed, or perhaps it stood still. Garrett couldn't tell. All he knew was the suffocating feeling of being trapped, unable to move, unable to escape. The voices around him seemed to mock him, taunting him with every passing second. "You will never escape," they whispered. "The fortune is eternal, and so are we." The fog lifted. Garrett's senses returned, slowly but surely. He was lying on cold stone, his body aching, his muscles stiff. He sat up, groaning as he rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the lingering effects of the strange, dreamlike encounter. The air was thick, still, and heavy with a presence that seemed to cling to the very walls of the place. It was familiar, too familiar. The room around him was different now. He wasn't in the eerie chamber anymore, but instead, he found himself in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with dark wooden doors, each one seemingly identical to the next. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the air oppressive and thick with the scent of decay. Duke's glowing eyes flashed in his mind again, the dog's mournful face imprinted in Garrett's memory. The fortune had claimed him, and now it was coming for Garrett, too. "Duke," Garrett whispered, "where are you?" But there was no answer. The hallway seemed endless, the doors leading nowhere, just like the mansion itself. The curse was alive, breathing, shifting, always changing. Garrett stood slowly, his legs unsteady, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to keep moving. He had to find a way out before it was too late. But as he turned to walk, the hallway seemed to stretch farther, and a door creaked open in the distance. Garrett felt his heart skip a beat. Behind that door, he knew, lay his next trial. This concludes Chapter 8. Let me know if you need any adjustments. The door creaked open slowly, and Garrett stood frozen for a moment, caught between fear and a strange sense of curiosity. The hallway had stretched endlessly before him, the silence surrounding him thick and suffocating. But now, a door had opened by itself, revealing something hidden behind it. His heart pounded in his chest, but he felt an inexplicable pull toward the open doorway. Something or someone was calling to him from beyond. Taking a deep breath, Garrett stepped forward, his footsteps echoing loudly in the unnerving quiet. The door was heavy, the wood groaning under his touch, but it opened with little resistance, revealing a room bathed in dim, flickering light. The air inside was thick, stale, and charged with an energy that set every nerve in his body on edge. There was a strange warmth to it, an unnatural heat that contrasted with the chill of the hallway. The room itself seemed to pulse with life, the walls adorned with strange symbols that seemed to shift and change as Garrett's gaze lingered on them. In the center of the room was a table, and atop it lay a small chest, almost identical to the one he had seen earlier. Its surface darkened with age, the intricate designs on it now obscured by dust and decay. The fortune. Garrett's pulse quickened as he took a step closer, unable to tear his eyes away from the chest. It was as though it was calling to him, its presence magnetic, drawing him in with an undeniable force. He reached out a trembling hand and placed it gently on the surface of the chest. And then the room shifted, the temperature dropped, and the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker, like the very atmosphere was folding in on itself. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, their designs becoming sharper, more intricate, as though they were alive. The whispers began again, their voices soft at first, then growing louder and more frantic, swirling around him like a violent storm. "You cannot escape it," they whispered. "You cannot run from the curse." Garrett felt a shiver run down his spine as the whispers grew louder, pressing in on him from all sides. He tried to step back, to leave the room, but it felt as though the walls were closing in on him, trapping him in this nightmare. He turned back toward the chest, and it seemed to pulse with energy, as though it were alive, waiting for him to make the next move. He swallowed hard, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Should he open it? Should he confront whatever lay inside? Or should he turn and run, abandon everything, and hope to escape this place before it consumed him? A voice, cold and distant, pierced through the chaos in his mind. "Open it," it whispered. "You cannot avoid your fate." Garrett's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. It was the Keeper's voice, the same voice that had warned him before, the one that had told him the fortune would never release him. The chest beckoned. The whispers pressed in around him, urging him forward, growing louder with every passing second. The very air seemed to thrum with anticipation, the temperature rising again as if the chest were calling to something deep within him. He had to know. Garrett's hand hovered over the lid of the chest, his heart pounding in his chest. A part of him wanted to pull away, to abandon this cursed place and escape the clutches of whatever dark force was waiting for him. But another part, something darker, urged him forward, driving him to open the chest and discover the secrets hidden inside. He forced his trembling fingers to grip the lid, and with one final, decisive motion, he lifted it. The room seemed to hold its breath. Inside the chest was a thick, dark mist that seemed to swirl and move, like a living entity. Garrett recoiled, but something, an unseen force, pushed him forward, urging him to reach into the mist. As his hand plunged into the darkness, he felt it, a sharp, cold sensation, like ice cutting into his skin. But then, the mist shifted, and something solid pressed against his palm. It was a book. He gripped it tightly, pulling it free from the chest and holding it up to the dim light. The cover was old and worn, the leather cracked with age. Strange symbols were embossed into the surface, the markings seeming to shimmer and shift as though they were alive. The title, written in a language Garrett could not understand, was etched in golden letters across the front. Felt wrong. He turned the book over in his hands, and as he did, a chill ran down his spine. On the back of the book was a symbol that seemed to be carved into the leather itself. It was the same symbol that had appeared on the walls of the mansion, the same symbol that had haunted him since the moment he had set foot in this cursed place. He had no idea what it meant, but he knew one thing for certain. The book was important. It held the key to the curse, to the fortune, to everything that had happened since he had arrived. The whispers intensified, the voices growing louder and more insistent. Garrett opened the book, and as he did, the air seemed to shimmer around him, the room twisting and warping as if the very fabric of reality was breaking apart. The pages inside were blank, empty, save for one strange symbol that appeared on every page. It was the same symbol that had appeared on the back of the book, the same one that had been etched into the walls. As Garrett turned the pages, the symbols seemed to dance, shifting in front of his eyes, twisting into shapes he couldn't quite comprehend. And then, in the center of the page, the words appeared. They were written in the same language as the title, but as Garrett stared at them, he felt an understanding deep within his mind. The words weren't just symbols, they were a message that he was finally beginning to comprehend. The fortune had never been a mere treasure. It was a curse. It was a curse. Adjustments. Garrett's hands trembled as he held the book open before him. The words on the pages seemed to come alive, writhing like shadows in the flickering light. As he stared at the symbols, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle deep in his chest. The fortune. It wasn't just a treasure. It was a curse, a dark force that had been hidden away for centuries. The book was its keeper, its vessel, and now, Garrett realized, it had chosen him. The voices around him had fallen silent, as though waiting for him to understand the weight of what he had uncovered. His heart pounded in his ears, the silence of the room deafening. He turned the pages carefully, each one revealing more of the curse's story, a story of betrayal, greed, and a long-forgotten pact with something far darker than he could ever imagine. The symbols began to make sense, one by one. The more he read, the clearer the message became. The fortune was never meant to be found. Those who had sought it out, those who had tried to claim it as their own, had always paid the price. And now, it seemed, Garrett was next. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He had come here seeking answers, seeking the truth behind his family's mysterious disappearance. But now he understood. This wasn't just about finding his family. This was about a curse that stretched back through generations. A curse that had followed him, that had always been waiting for him to return. He slammed the book shut, the sound echoing through the room like a thunderclap. He couldn't read anymore. He couldn't bear to know anymore. And yet, something inside him urged him to keep going, to finish what he had started. But then, as his fingers gripped the book's leather cover, a sharp, biting pain shot through his hand. It was as if the book itself was alive, punishing him for daring to read its secrets. He pulled his hand back, staring at his palm, which had begun to bleed. The symbol from the back of the book was burned into his skin, etched into his flesh like a mark of ownership. A chilling realization swept over him. He was marked. There was no going back. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls shifting and groaning like they were alive. The flickering light above him buzzed erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance and move of their own accord. Suddenly, there was a sound, soft at first, then growing louder, like the distant sound of footsteps. Someone or something was coming toward him. Garrett's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were directly behind him. He spun around, heart racing, expecting to see something, someone, but there was nothing. The room was empty, save for the book, the chest, and the ominous symbols on the walls. And yet, he could feel it. A presence, a cold, suffocating presence, watching him from the shadows. The air seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping rapidly. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he looked around the room, his eyes desperately searching for any sign of movement. And then, from the corner of the room, a figure emerged. It was tall, shrouded in shadow, its features obscured by the darkness. But Garrett could feel its eyes on him, burning through the blackness, piercing straight to his soul. The figure took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate. Garrett backed away instinctively, his heart hammering in his chest. But no matter how far he retreated, the figure continued to advance, moving closer and closer until it was almost within arm's reach. The whispers returned, soft and chilling, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. They filled the room, drowning out all other sounds, their words incomprehensible and yet painfully familiar. "You've disturbed it," the voices hissed. "You've awoken the curse." Garrett's legs trembled, his mind reeling with fear and confusion. He had to get out of there. He had to escape. But the figure, whatever it was blocking his path, its presence so overwhelming that he could barely think straight. The figure raised its hand, and as it did, the shadows in the room seemed to warp and twist, becoming thick and oppressive. Garrett stumbled backward, his heart racing as the figure's voice, a voice like 1,000 whispers, spoke. "You cannot escape what has been set in motion." The words sent a chill down his spine. He was trapped, and there was no way out. The curse had him now, and there was no escaping it. "Everything you've done," the figure continued, its voice like ice, "has led you here. The fortune you seek, the answers you crave, they will destroy you, just as they have destroyed all who came before you." Garrett tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. His body was paralyzed with fear, his mind racing as the figure took another step forward, closing the distance between them. And then, with a sudden, swift motion, the figure reached out and grabbed him by the arm, its grip cold and unyielding. The pain in Garrett's hand intensified, the mark from the book burning into his skin as though it were alive. The figure leaned in close, its breath cold against Garrett's ear, and whispered a single word, "Run!" And then, as if the world itself had shifted, the figure vanished, leaving Garrett standing alone in the now empty room. His heart was still pounding, his body shaking with terror. The air felt thick with an oppressive force, as though the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. But as Garrett stood there, his mind racing with questions, he knew one thing for certain: the curse had not been vanquished. It had merely been awakened, and it would stop at nothing to see him pay the price. Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that the room had changed. The air was thick, and the once familiar scent of old wood and dust now carried a strange metallic tang, as if the very walls had absorbed the curse's weight. His pulse was erratic, his thoughts fragmented, as he fought to steady his breath. The figure that had appeared before him, the one he couldn't quite understand, was still fresh in his mind. He remembered the chilling words, "Run!" Was it an ally? Or had it been yet another manifestation of the curse, urging him toward his inevitable doom? His hand still burned where the figure had touched him. The mark had deepened, and now it wasn't just a brand on his skin. It felt like a part of him, an unshakable, malignant presence that throbbed beneath the surface. For a moment, Garrett considered fleeing the manor altogether, running far from the shadows of his family's twisted legacy. But some deep, gnawing instinct stopped him. The truth was close. He could feel it, just out of reach, like a ghost brushing against the edge of his consciousness. But as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the room began to change again. The shadows, which had once been mere trickles of darkness, were now moving, shifting like living things, as if they were aware of his every movement. He needed to find answers, but where? The book had offered him no clear solution, and the cryptic whispers from the figure seemed to mock him, a riddle he couldn't decipher. Garrett stood in the center of the room, his mind racing. The walls felt like they were closing in, the floor beneath him creaking with every step he took. The oppressive darkness was suffocating, but he couldn't leave without understanding what had happened to his family, what they had uncovered, and, most importantly, what had destroyed them. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the manor. It was distant at first, muffled, as though coming from deep within the building. Garrett froze. His heart skipped a beat. Was it real, or was it another trick of the curse, another twisted hallucination meant to torment him? But the sound came again, this time closer, unmistakable, footsteps, slow and deliberate. Someone or something was approaching. Garrett's breath hitched in his throat. He couldn't hide. There was nowhere left to run. His only option now was to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew this was no longer just about solving the mystery of the vanished fortune. It was about survival. Taking a deep breath, Garrett began to move toward the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last, the darkness pressing against him like an invisible force. His heart pounded in his chest, his every nerve on edge as he crept toward the source of the noise. The footsteps grew louder with each passing moment, until they were nearly deafening. Garrett's eyes scanned the hallway, searching for any sign of movement. But all he could see were the walls, their cracked surfaces seemingly whispering to him in a language he couldn't understand. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, Garrett wondered if he was truly alone. He turned a corner, following the sounds of the footsteps, but what he saw when he rounded the bend made his blood run cold. The figure from before, tall, shadowed, and impossibly still, stood at the far end of the hallway. His back was to him, but Garrett knew it had to have been aware of his presence. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge him in any way. It just stood there, silent and unmoving, like a monument to something ancient and forgotten. And then, from the darkness beyond the figure, something else appeared, faint at first, like a flicker in the corner of his eye. But as Garrett's eyes adjusted, the shape grew clearer, a shadow long and twisting, like the silhouette of a man, but not quite. It moved with unnatural speed, darting toward the figure at the end of the hall. For a split second, Garrett thought it was just another trick of the light, but the way it moved, quick, fluid, and purposeful, sent a chill down his spine. The figure in front of him turned slowly, its head twisting at an odd angle as it fixed its gaze on Garrett. There was no expression on its face, but the sensation of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming. A low, guttural sound rumbled from the shadows, a voice that was both distant and close at the same time. "You shouldn't have come." Garrett's legs threatened to give way beneath him, but he forced himself to stand tall. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. This wasn't just a figure. It was something else, something tied to the curse. It wasn't a warning, it was a judgment. Before Garrett could move, the figure lunged at him, impossibly fast. The air seemed to ripple as the shadow passed by, its movement so quick it left a trail of coldness in its wake. Garrett staggered backward, heart pounding, narrowly avoiding the entity's grasp. But it wasn't done. No, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a manifestation of something far more dangerous, something that wanted him to suffer. Garrett turned and ran. His breath came in ragged gasps as his feet pounded against the floor, his mind whirling with panic. He had to get away. He had to find a way out of this cursed place before it consumed him completely. But the shadows were closing in, wrapping around him like tendrils of darkness. He could feel their cold touch on his skin, could hear their whispering voices urging him to stop, to give in. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. The walls seemed to shift, their angles warping as though the very structure of the house was alive, changing to trap him. Suddenly, the ground beneath Garrett's feet gave way, and he fell, tumbling through the floor, down into a dark abyss. His body hit the ground with a sickening thud, but there was no pain, only the overwhelming sensation of falling. For a moment, he lost consciousness, and when he awoke, he found himself in a room unlike any he had seen before. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that he recognized from the book, only these were larger, etched into the very stone. In the center of the room, a pedestal stood, and on it, a glimmering object. The fortune. Garrett didn't have the strength to move. He could barely lift his head as he stared at the object on the pedestal. Whatever it was calling to him, and he knew, deep in his gut, that this was the moment everything would change. The curse had led him here, and now it would take everything. Garrett's body felt like it was made of stone, heavy and unresponsive, as he slowly forced himself to sit up. The room around him was suffocating in its silence, but the flickering light coming from the pedestal before him held his gaze. It was as if the object on the pedestal pulsed with a strange energy, calling to him from across the room. He had to move. Every instinct in him screamed to leave, to run, to escape, to get out of the house and away from whatever cursed this place. But the object on the pedestal, there was something about it, a pull, a magnetic force that kept him rooted in place. The fortune? Could it really be the thing he had been searching for all this time? Garrett's eyes flicked over the strange symbols on the walls. The markings seemed to dance in the dim light, moving in ways they shouldn't have. They were no longer static, no longer just lines etched into stone. They were alive, shifting and twisting, as if the walls themselves were part of the curse, part of the very thing that had kept the house standing for so long. He rubbed his temples, trying to clear his mind. The words of the figure from the hallway echoed in his head. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come. Asterisk. But it was too late. There was no turning back now. Garrett forced himself to stand, his legs trembling beneath him as he staggered toward the pedestal. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the room itself was trying to hold him in place. But the object called to him, louder now, urging him forward. When he finally reached the pedestal, the air around him grew colder. The object, gleaming, smooth, and utterly out of place in the dim, ancient room, was made of a material that Garrett couldn't quite place. It shimmered like metal, but the way it reflected the light was almost unnatural. A deep, haunting glow seemed to emanate from it, like it was alive, breathing. His hand hovered above the object, but he hesitated. The stories, the warnings, all the things he had learned from the book, the figure, the house, it all pointed to this moment, to this object. The curse had led him here for a reason, but what was it? He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to center himself. When he opened them again, he saw something that stopped him cold. The room, once static, was changing again. The walls were closing in, slowly but relentlessly. The floor beneath him seemed to buckle, as if the entire structure of the house was shifting to swallow him whole. Time was running out. Garrett reached forward, his fingers brushing the surface of the object. The moment he made contact, a shockwave of energy surged through his body, a searing heat that radiated from the object and flooded his veins. His heart skipped a beat as the world around him seemed to warp and distort. He felt like he was falling, like he was being pulled in every direction at once. The shadows that had been so quiet before now roared to life. They stretched toward him, twisting and undulating, like tendrils of darkness reaching out to claim him. He tried to pull away, but it was too late. The force holding the object was too powerful. A voice, one he knew all too well, echoed through the room. It was the same voice from the figure in the hallway, the same chilling voice that had warned him. You should have listened. Before he could react, the room exploded with blinding light, and Garrett was thrown backward, crashing to the ground. His head slammed into the cold stone floor, and for a moment, everything went black. When Garrett regained consciousness, the world around him was still and silent. The air was thick, and he could feel a weight pressing down on him, both physical and emotional. The shadows, the symbols, they were all gone, replaced by an eerie calm. He slowly sat up, groaning in pain, his body aching from the impact. His mind was foggy, and he struggled to piece together what had just happened. What was this place? What had he uncovered? But as he looked around, he saw that he wasn't alone. Standing at the far end of the room was a figure. This time, Garrett didn't hesitate. He knew who it was, the figure from before, the one who had warned him. But this time, the figure didn't move. It stood, unmoving, like a statue. There was no menace in its stance, no threat, but the weight of its presence was overwhelming. Garrett could feel his heart racing again as he tried to stand. His legs trembled beneath him, but he forced himself to rise. He had to know. He had to understand what was happening. The figure spoke, its voice not loud, but it carried through the room, as if every word was etched into the air itself. "You've awakened it," the figure said, its voice heavy with both sorrow and warning. "You've disturbed something that should have remained buried." Garrett's breath caught in his throat. He stepped forward, cautiously, trying to find the courage to speak. "What is it? What have I done?" he asked, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer right away. It simply stared at him, its eyes hollow and endless. And then, as if it had been waiting for him to truly comprehend the gravity of the situation, it spoke again. "It was never meant to be found," the figure said. "The fortune you seek is not a blessing. It is a curse that has claimed generations before you, and now it has claimed you." The weight of the words hung in the air, suffocating Garrett. The book, the hidden fortunes, the symbols, it had all been part of a trap meant to lure him into this very moment. He felt the chill of the room seep deeper into his bones as the figure continued. "You've opened the door," it said, its tone somber, "and now you must face what lies beyond it." Garrett's mind was racing. His family's legacy, his search for answers, it had all led him here, to this cursed place. But what was beyond the door? What had he unleashed? Before he could ask more questions, the figure raised a hand, and the shadows in the room seemed to stir, swirling around them like a storm. The very walls trembled, as if the house itself was awakening, and with it, something darker. "You have no choice now," the figure said, as its form began to fade into the darkness. "The curse will follow you, no matter where you go." And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Garrett stood alone in the darkness, the weight of the curse pressing down on him like a vice. He had no answers, only more questions. The fortune was not a blessing, but a trap, a curse that had claimed his family and now, it seemed, was claiming him as well. The house was alive and it was hungry. Garrett stood frozen in the center of the room, the weight of the figure's words pressing on him like an unbearable burden. The air was thick with an energy he couldn't comprehend, and the shadows around him seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to escape the house, but he couldn't. Not now. Not when the answers were so close. The figure's warning echoed in his mind. "The curse will follow you no matter where you go." He felt it then, creeping beneath his skin, settling in the pit of his stomach. Something was after him, something ancient, something powerful. The fortune he had sought so desperately was not just a thing of wealth. It was a malignant force, bound to the house and its dark history. And now it had found him. The walls around him seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and swirling as if alive, watching, waiting. The temperature in the room dropped, and Garrett could feel the cold seeping into his very bones. His breath came out in misty clouds, his heart pounding in his chest. A distant sound echoed through the hallways, a soft scraping, like something or someone was dragging across the floor. Garrett's eyes snapped to the door, but it remained closed. The noise grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from right behind him. Spinning around, Garrett's eyes darted to every corner of the room. Nothing. But then, a soft whisper, barely audible, seemed to tickle the back of his neck. Asterisk, "You can never escape." Asterisk. The voice was faint, almost indistinguishable from the cold wind that began to howl through the cracks in the walls, but it was there. A presence, one that had always been lurking, now closer than ever. His heart raced as he turned back to the pedestal, the object still sitting there, gleaming in the faint light. The fortune? It seemed to be mocking him now, calling him back, pulling him toward it with an irresistible force. His hand trembled as he reached out to it, but before he could touch it again, a figure appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the darkened hallway. It was a man, no, not a man, not entirely. He was tall, too tall, his features obscured by shadows that seemed to ripple around him. His face was indistinct, but Garrett could feel his eyes on him, though there were no eyes to see. The figure stepped forward, moving with an unnatural grace, each movement fluid and deliberate. The figure spoke, its voice low and gravelly, like the scrape of metal on stone. "You should have left when you had the chance." Garrett stumbled backward, his pulse racing. The figure's presence was suffocating, a weight that crushed him with every passing second. "Who are you?" Garrett demanded, his voice shaking. The figure didn't answer immediately. It just stood there, watching him with that invisible gaze. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the figure raised a hand, pointing toward the pedestal. "The fortune you seek," the figure said, "is not a gift, it is a prison." Garrett's eyes snapped to the object on the pedestal. The words sent a chill through his spine. Prison? But that didn't make sense. It was supposed to be the key to his family's legacy, the treasure that would change everything. His mind raced with questions, but the figure didn't give him time to ask. "The curse binds you," the figure continued, its voice becoming more distorted, more eerie. "You, like those before you, are trapped by your desire, your greed. It is not just a fortune, it is a pact." Garrett's throat went dry. His mind was spinning. He had to get out of here, but he couldn't leave without answers. He needed to know what was going on, what he had stumbled upon. But the figure wasn't done. "You will never leave this house," it said, its voice now tinged with something darker. "Not with the fortune, not with the curse. It will follow you wherever you go." The air grew colder still, and the shadows in the room seemed to writhe, twisting around Garrett like serpents closing in for the kill. Panic surged in his chest, and he could feel the weight of the curse tightening around him. The house was alive and it was claiming him, but there had to be a way out. There had to be something he could do. Desperation clawed at his mind, but before he could react, the figure moved again, stepping closer. "Leave now," the figure said. "Leave or become one with the house." Garrett's legs trembled, but he forced himself to take a step back, then another. His heart raced in his chest as he turned, his eyes still locked on the figure, but the room around him shifted, warping, changing. It was like the very air was bending to the will of the house, trapping him in its endless maze. The figure's voice echoed in the distance, growing fainter as Garrett stumbled toward the door. "You can't escape it. You've already made the choice. The curse is yours." Garrett's pulse raced, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He reached the door, his hand grabbing the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, desperation flooding his veins, but the door refused to open. It was no use. The house had sealed him in. "Help!" he screamed, but the words seemed to vanish into the air. No one could hear him, not anymore. He was alone, trapped in this nightmare of his own making. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted, and he fell to his knees, a sharp pain shooting through his leg as he landed. The walls trembled again, and the shadows in the corners of the room grew longer, darker. The air felt thicker now, like it was pressing down on him, suffocating him. He knew, deep down, that there was no escaping this place. The curse had already claimed him. The fortune, the treasure, it was never meant to be found. And now he was part of its story. The house seemed to breathe with an unnatural rhythm, its walls groaning under the weight of years gone by, centuries of secrets locked away. Garrett's mind swam in a sea of confusion, his heart a drumbeat of frantic desperation. He was no longer sure what was real. The figure's warning haunted him, and the darkness in the room seemed to close in tighter with each passing second. His legs ached, and his hands trembled as he tried to stand, but the floor felt like it was shifting beneath him. The very foundation of the house seemed unstable, as though it could collapse at any moment. But Garrett didn't have the luxury of thinking about the house's collapse. His focus was solely on one thing: escaping. He turned his attention back to the door, grasping the cold handle once again. The wood beneath his fingertips seemed to pulse with the house's heartbeat, as if it were alive, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He pushed against it, but the door didn't budge. It was no use. Whatever had locked him in this room had taken full control of his surroundings. But there had to be a way out. There had to be something he was missing. His eyes scanned the room, desperate for a clue, for a sign that might lead him to the truth, or to freedom. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted again, as though they had a life of their own. He could hear the faint scraping noise once more, that unnerving sound of something being dragged. "Who's there?" Garrett shouted, his voice raw with panic. But only the house responded, its creaks and groans the only answer. It was as if the walls themselves had become sentient, conspiring against him. He couldn't take it anymore. The pressure, the isolation, the constant whispers in the dark. It was all too much. The fortune, the curse, the figure. It was all linked together, a puzzle he couldn't solve no matter how hard he tried. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Garrett saw something. A flash of movement. A figure, barely discernible in the shadowed hallway outside the room. Garrett's breath caught in his throat. Was it the same figure that had spoken to him? Or was it someone else? Someone who could help him? His heart pounded in his chest as he staggered toward the figure, hoping, praying that they could guide him out of this nightmare. But as he moved closer, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the darkness like a wisp of smoke. It wasn't real. It was just another part of the house's twisted game. "No," Garrett muttered to himself, frustration and fear mixing into a bitter cocktail. He couldn't give up. Not now. Not when he was so close to the answers he needed. There had to be something, some way to break free from the house's grip. Suddenly, the room felt colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. Garrett shivered, feeling the chills sink into his bones. He rubbed his arms, trying to warm himself, but it didn't help. The cold was not just physical. It was something deeper, something far more sinister. And then it happened. A low, guttural growl echoed through the room. Garrett froze, his body going rigid with terror. The sound came from somewhere close by, too close. His eyes darted around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the darkness. The oppressive shadows that seemed to twist and turn with a life of their own. The growl came again, louder this time, a rumble that vibrated the very air. Garrett's breath caught in his throat, and he spun toward the sound. There, in the far corner of the room, something moved. It was large, hulking, and its eyes glowed with a faint, unsettling light. Garrett's heart raced as he took a step back, realizing with sickening clarity that the creature was no man. It was something else entirely. Something born of the house. The creature snarled, stepping forward, its massive form emerging from the shadows. It had the body of a beast, but there was something wrong with it, something twisted, unnatural. Its fur was matted and dark, its claws long and sharp like blades, and its eyes, those glowing eyes, were filled with a malice that chilled Garrett to his very core. His mind raced, scrambling for any possible escape, but there was no way out. The house had trapped him, and now it had unleashed its worst nightmare upon him. The creature's growl reverberated through the room, sending a wave of pure terror through his body. Garrett backed away, his legs trembling beneath him, but the creature advanced, its steps heavy and deliberate. It was as if it knew no fear, no hesitation. It was a predator, and Garrett was its prey. Suddenly, the creature lunged. With a shriek of terror, Garrett stumbled backward, falling to the floor, his hands scraping against the cold, rough wood. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing for a way to fight back, but there was nothing. No weapon, no tool, nothing to defend himself against the creature's wrath. The beast circled him, its glowing eyes never leaving him, its low growls filling the air. Garrett's heart was a drum in his chest, pounding louder and louder as the creature moved closer. He could feel its hot breath on his skin, smell the rancid odor of decay that emanated from it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stopped. It stood there, watching him, its eyes filled with an intelligence that sent a shiver down Garrett's spine. It was like the creature was waiting for something Garrett could not understand. Without warning, the creature let out a bone-chilling howl, a sound so piercing it seemed to shatter the very air. Garrett covered his ears, falling to his knees, the noise overwhelming him. The house shook, its foundations groaning in protest as if the creature's cry had awakened something deep within the walls. And then, as quickly as it had come, the creature vanished. The room went silent, the only sound now the rapid pounding of Garrett's heart. His body trembled, drenched in sweat, his mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been real, or had it been some twisted illusion created by the house? But Garrett knew one thing for certain now. The creature, the curse, the house. It was all connected, and he was no closer to escaping. Garrett stood in the center of the room, his heart still pounding in his chest. The encounter with the creature had left him shaken, but he couldn't afford to let fear paralyze him. He had to push forward. The house, with all its secrets and horrors, wasn't going to release him easily. It would take everything he had, his strength, his mind, and his will to survive. The silence that had followed the creature's disappearance was deafening. The walls, which moments ago had been alive with the sound of growls and the house's groans, were now completely still. Garrett could feel the weight of the air pressing down on him, as if the very house was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. He glanced around the room again, his mind racing. The creature had vanished, but the darkness hadn't. It was still there, lurking in the corners of the room, watching him. There was something about the way the shadows clung to the walls, something wrong with the air, as if it was charged with an energy he couldn't understand. He couldn't stay here. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The house had shown him its most terrifying side, and it was clear that the creature wasn't the only thing lurking in the shadows. There was something more, something deeper, something he needed to uncover if he was going to escape. Garrett took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had no plan, no clear idea of what he was up against. But he had one advantage. He knew he couldn't trust the house. It would lie, it would deceive, and it would manipulate him. But somewhere, in the depths of its labyrinthine halls, there was a truth he could latch onto. He needed to find the heart of the house. The problem was, the house didn't want him to find it. He moved cautiously, his steps slow and deliberate as he walked toward the door. The cold metal of the handle burned his skin as he turned it, but the door remained locked. The sound of his heartbeat was all he could hear, a constant thrum in his ears. He couldn't afford to panic, couldn't afford to let the fear take over. But the more he pulled at the door, the more it seemed to resist him. The walls pressed in, suffocating him, as if the house itself was tightening around him. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, but he forced himself to remain calm. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to stop this madness. In the midst of his panic, something caught his eye, a crack in the wall. It wasn't large, barely noticeable, but Garrett's instincts kicked in. He approached it carefully, brushing his fingers along the edges. The stone was cold and rough beneath his touch, but the crack seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if it was calling to him. His mind raced, and suddenly the pieces began to fit together. This house, with its twisted corridors, its oppressive darkness, it was a maze, a puzzle designed to trap him. But the cracks, the hidden spaces, they were the key. They were the fractures in the house's facade, the weak points he could exploit to find his way out. Garrett stepped back, taking a long, steadying breath. His hands were shaking, but he ignored the tremors. He had no choice now. There was no going back. He ran his hand over the crack again, this time pressing harder, as if willing the house to give him an answer. There was no immediate response, no sudden revelation. But then, the stone under his fingers began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a small shift in the stone, as if something was moving behind it. Garrett's pulse quickened. The crack widened ever so slightly, revealing a thin, narrow passage behind the wall. His breath caught in his throat. The house had been hiding something. With a mix of dread and determination, Garrett knelt down, carefully peeling away the stone. The crack widened more, and with each movement, the passage became clearer. It was dark beyond, but Garrett could sense it. There was something important through that hole, something that could lead him to the answers he desperately needed. He crawled through the opening, his body cramped in the narrow space. The air was thick with dust, and the darkness pressed against him from all sides. His hands scraped against the rough stone, but he didn't stop. He had to keep moving forward. There was no turning back now. After what felt like an eternity, he emerged into a dimly lit chamber. The room was small, tucked away deep within the bowels of the house, and it was cold, unnaturally cold, like the temperature had dropped a dozen degrees in an instant. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with old, dusty books and strange artifacts. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and something older, something ancient. Garrett's eyes scanned the room, drawn to a large, weathered book sitting on a pedestal in the center of the room. The book was open, its pages yellowed and frayed with age. But it was the symbol on the cover that caught his attention. It was the same symbol he had seen in the hallway, the one that had been etched into the floorboards, the one that had been a constant presence throughout his time in the house. The mark of the curse. The truth was here. The answer to everything. The vanished fortune, the house's dark secrets, the creature that had hunted him. It was all written here. But as Garrett stepped closer to the pedestal, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the dim candlelight. The shadows in the corners of the chamber seemed to grow, thickening, swirling as though they had a life of their own. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the room. The house wasn't going to let him have it. The book, the truth, it was its last defense, and it would do anything to keep him from learning the final secret. Garrett's fingers brushed the pages, and a sharp pain shot through his arm. The book wasn't just an object, it was alive. The pain spread through his body, seizing his muscles, his mind. He had to pull away, had to let go. But the book had other plans. The shadows converged around him, and the air grew thick with darkness. The house was closing in, and Garrett realized, too late, that the vanished fortune